When I was a little younger and trying to get my feet on the ground, I got a job in a very off-the-grid little town, one stop sign with a gas station kind of place. There weren't apartments to be had here, but there were a couple of homes for rent. The house I stayed in during this time was quite old. There really wasn't any history on the house. The landlord's family owned a lot of land in that area, and they happened to buy this up after it had been vacant for some time. Things like the kitchen and bathrooms had been modernized, but you could tell the original floor plan hadn't been touched in all these years. The house was fine, plenty of space, quiet neighborhood, and I came to appreciate the saying about things not being built like they used to be, because this house was solid. Outside, though, was a little outbuilding that was supposed to be for yard equipment and such, but my landlord was cool and cut the grass for me, so I never really had any reason to go in there. When we first moved in, I went in just to check it out. Didn't really think about it too much as we were moving in on a hot summer afternoon. I just stuck my head in and acknowledged it was there. A couple months later, I have a friend come stay with me for a few days. He rides in on a motorcycle. There's no garage or carport or anything. He kind of parks it close to the porch, but a huge rainstorm starts to kick up. He gets concerned, so I offer to put it in the outbuilding as there's nothing else out there. This outbuilding just has a large double door that is latched from the outside, so I grab the key and a flashlight, as it has no electricity, and run out to open it. He pulls his bike up as I'm opening the door and stepping inside from the rain. It's a little before sunset, but it's still pretty freaking dark inside as there are no windows. Standing in the middle of this room now, I get a weird feeling. Still can't explain what exactly it was, just that low-key anxiety that comes when something feels off. I start looking around. There are some shelves sparsely littered with some old oil cans and rusted-out tools, but in the corner there is this kind of unused space where there are no shelves, and I see something on the wall. I draw closer to see what look like tally marks, the 4 lines with a 5th diagonal line through it, like someone was counting. Thing is, there were something like 132 marks. I remember there being 2 lines by themselves at the very end. My friend gets his bike in and wanders up to see what I'm looking at, and we both just stare and awkwardly try to guess at what happened. We let it go, and I make sure to lock the outbuilding on our way out. We checked the next morning. Nothing happened to the bike. We looked around some more to see if there was anything else like those tally marks now that we had daylight. Couldn't find anything. The day after that, my friend went to leave and tried to crank his bike up in the shed. It wouldn't start at first. He kept trying and it eventually turned over, but he said he had recently done a tune-up and it had no problems up until this point. He was finally able to leave and later told me he had to put a new battery in it, even though the battery he had was still pretty new. This gave me a little cause for concern. Was something in my shed? Or had something been in there? Were those marks days it had been in there? I didn't know how to ask my landlord about it. Even if he didn't know, I felt like he should know now. The next time he came by to cut the grass, I caught him outside and asked him to come see the marks in the shed and explained about my friend's dead battery. His face went pale. He stammered over his words as he tried to tell me that he didn't know anything about it. He said he'd look into it and see if he could dig something up, but he never did get back with me. I eventually just let it go. It was a little hard to sleep for a few days, but again, nothing beyond that ever happened. I just never went back into that shed again, and I ended up moving away about a year later anyway. My church youth group when I was a teenager was having a lock-in, where you stay at the church overnight as kind of a group slumber party with a few adults on hand to chaperone. We were in the fellowship hall, which had several rooms branching off, and different groups had different activities going in each room. Some of the adults were taking this time to change out decorations. I was helping a little, and they asked me to go into the sanctuary to grab a cloth that had been a set piece at the altar to use in whatever they were doing in the common area. The sanctuary was its own building, some small distance away from the fellowship hall, but connected by a covered walkway. They gave me the key and sent me on my way. Simple request. I stepped out into the brisk night air, made the short trek to the sanctuary door, unlocked it, and stepped in. Didn't realize how dark the sanctuary would be this late at night. The light switch was not right next to the door either. It was down the wall some distance. I felt uneasy and started fumbling quickly, trying to find it. Finally got to it, and everything lit up. What was I scared of? Just a little fear of the dark is all. I went and grabbed the cloth as instructed and started to turn back for the door, which now seemed so very far away. And although I was in a sacred place, I got this really tight feeling in my chest like I was being watched. I scanned all around the sanctuary. Didn't look like anyone had broken in or was squatting there. I all but ran back toward the door, then remembered I had to turn off the light. F. I stood by the switch for a moment, looked around one last time, then flipped it and sprinted for the door. As I flung open the door, the feeling suddenly got much worse. It was like something was stalking me, was very close by. I made sure the door was shut all the way, and the dutiful part of me said that I needed to make sure it was locked in case there was something out here that could slip inside the sanctuary. My hand was trembling wildly, though, and I finally gave up and flew into the fellowship hall. The ladies who had asked me to get the cloth noticed I was shaken up and asked if something had happened. I explained what it felt like happened, even though I didn't see anything. I felt kind of silly saying it, but one of the adult men overheard and asked me about it again, then went over to check for himself. He spent a few minutes over there, came back and said he didn't see anything, but assured me that I wasn't wrong for feeling a little scared and so forth. I did notice, though, he hung out by the door for a few seconds more and continued to look through the window outside before finally going back to whatever he was doing before. I don't know why I was convinced that something was out to get me that night. I've been by myself at night, in big rooms and outside. I've even been back in that sanctuary alone since then, and I've never had that same sense of danger. Maybe some baser survival instinct kicked in and picked up on something I wasn't paying attention to, I don't know. But I do believe something was lurking around that night. I used to be a teenage delinquent and run around with other teenage delinquents. The town we lived in had a cemetery that wasn't contained into one big lot, but rather spanned a few of the older city blocks. We could just drive up, and as long as we weren't loud and parked our cars smartly, we didn't really have any security or police presence to deal with. And so, as teenage delinquents do, we occasionally hung out in the graveyard a little after sunset, sometimes would hang around until it got pretty dark. We had a few people who had their reasons for wanting to be among the dead, but really most, if not all of us, were there because of the on-edge feeling of being in a place we shouldn't be, knowing we would be okay, but our imaginations jumping at every noise we heard. Most nights, we'd just shoot the bull, drink, mainly sodas, but the occasional alcoholic beverage, and wander around aimlessly. We never trashed the place, always cleaned up after ourselves, and generally were respectful of the fact we were haunting many people's final resting place. When there was still light to see, we'd read tombstones and see if we could piece together some of the histories of the people buried there. We got braver and braver, going further in every time we'd go. One block was a good bit bigger than the others, and one evening we decided to go in and explore as much of that as we could. Again, it was a very old cemetery, and most people had passed long before I or even my parents were born. They had very simple, old markers at their plots. In this big section, though, was a fairly large, round, stone mausoleum. Oddly, there wasn't any name or plaque displayed, and it didn't look like there was a door to go in. It honestly looked as though it had been built around whoever was interred there. We stared at it for a little bit, then most of us shrugged and went on. I stayed back and kept watching. There was something about this monument that seemed off to me. Maybe it was the odd construction, or the fact that it looked fairly new and clean compared to many of the older tombstones around. But, weird as it sounds, it was like it was staring back at me. I got the attention of one of my friends before he walked off with the rest of the group, and asked what he thought. He agreed. We stood there for what was probably a few minutes, gazing at this thing. He started to step forward and reach out to touch it, then collected himself and pulled back. He said there was a moment of crystal clarity in his mind, saying, "Don't." We finally decided to move on and began to catch up with the group. A few weeks later, on a Friday, it was a cloudless night with a nearly full moon, and most of our friend group was coming off a rough week. We decided to get some drinks and get a little wild at the meeting spot. Again, the plan was not to act out, just let our hair down a little. Well, one of our group had fallen in with some new friends and somehow had indirectly invited them to the hangout. They didn't know the rules, didn't know how to act. They came in and started getting really loud, throwing beer cans on the ground instead of putting them in a sack to throw away later. A few of us tried to break off and go deeper into the cemetery, but the new guys followed. They kept trashing things, making a scene. We thought we might actually have the cops come by for the first time since ever. Our friend who invited them finally snapped when one said he had to take a leak and was starting to position himself over one of the graves. He gave them an earful, then apologized to the rest of us and escorted them out. We thanked him for handling it, and we started to slowly head back toward the main road so we could try to enjoy a few more minutes here before going home. I hung back for a bit, was making sure there was no trash left behind. I thought I saw something in the corner of my eyes, so I looked up and didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but I was looking right at that ominous mausoleum. My heart stopped for a sec before I kind of laughed it off and began scanning the ground again. But now, even though my friends had all gone back, there was a feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept looking at the mausoleum. It stood out particularly on this moonlit night. I began backing away, keeping it in my sights. The air had become very still, and what few night creatures were still sounding off had gone mostly quiet. I turned and started walking forward so I wouldn't trip over anything. I then felt a chilly air at my back. I turned around to take in the mausoleum one last time and saw a faded figure standing beside it. I froze like a deer in headlights. I realized it was human-shaped and seemed to be looking back at me. "Oh, shh," I uttered, and quickly began walking forward again, trying to get away without full-blown panic sprinting. I walked some distance, thought to myself, maybe it was just my imagination. I turned back to see how the scene looked behind me, and there it stood, still faded but almost shining under the moonlight, the same distance it had originally been from me, but now standing in the middle of a line of graves. I cussed again and picked up my pace, crossing the road and trekking through another block of the cemetery. I could feel a stare drilling into my back. As I made it to the next road, which I could then turn onto and walk down the side of to eventually get back to my car, I turned back again to see that it had closed much more distance, and I could almost make out features now. I broke into a run now that I was on smooth asphalt, and up ahead I could see my friend, the one who I had previously discussed the mausoleum with, was waiting for me. I went up to him and told him what I saw, pointed back toward the cemetery to see nothing at first, which frustrated me. I knew what I saw and wanted someone else to affirm it. We kept looking, watching silently. About the time he said he didn't see anything, we saw a figure walking from right to left, fading into view and pausing for just a second before continuing on and fading away. We both had a collective freak-out moment over it, figured maybe somebody buried there or maybe whoever was in the crypt had had enough of the loud guys and wanted to make its displeasure known. After we calmed down, we got into our cars and he drove away first. I took an extra second to get my bearings straight before I put it in drive and started to pull away. And as I was starting to get up to speed, I saw on the sidewalk running alongside the front portion of the graveyard a dark figure that, as my headlights began to shine onto it, became the distinct visage of a very stern-faced older man glaring at me as I went by. It was but for a second I saw him, but time almost stopped, and as I drove by, he craned his neck around so that he was looking inside my window at me as I went around. I admittedly screamed a little and sped up, never looked back. The story made its way around to my friends, and we decided it was probably best to stop hanging out at that cemetery. As the rumor spread, though, some of the more cocky kids, including the ones who had crashed our party that night, decided they weren't afraid and went back a couple of weeks later. Never heard what happened when they went back, but everyone noticed that they were very quiet and a little jumpy for a few days after.